In September 1944, the Allied armies stood on the threshold of Germany. Nazi forces were in retreat. Paris had been liberated, and the end of the war seemed tantalizingly close. It was in this moment of triumph that one of the most daring and controversial operations of World War II was born. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a plan so bold that it promised to smash through German defenses, cross the Rhine in a single leap, and possibly end the war by Christmas. The operation was called Market Garden, and it would send tens of thousands of paratroopers deep behind enemy lines in the largest airborne assault in history. But what began as a vision of swift victory turned into one of the costliest Allied defeats of the entire war. Thousands of elite soldiers found themselves trapped in a brutal battle they could not win, fighting desperately for a bridge that became a symbol of ambition pushed too far. This is the story of Market Garden, a story of courage, miscalculation, and the terrible price paid when bold plans collide with harsh reality. Chapter 1. A Bridge Too Far, Montgomery's Grand Gamble. In the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe looked, at first glance, almost won. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. Paris was liberated, and Anglo-American forces were racing through France and Belgium. Many soldiers joked that they would be home by Christmas. But behind this confidence lay a growing problem. The advance was outrunning its own supplies. Ammunition, fuel, and food were crawling forward on jammed roads and ruined railways, while key ports remained in German hands. The Allied spearheads were sharp, but the blade was dangerously thin. Into this situation stepped Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery with a proposal that matched his reputation for ambition. Instead of slowly grinding forward along the entire front, he argued for a single, concentrated blow. The idea was bold and simple. Drive one armored fist straight into the northern flank of Germany, punch across the great rivers in the Netherlands, and crack open the gateway to the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. If this thrust succeeded, it might shatter German resistance in the West and bring the war much closer to an early end. The operation that emerged from this vision was given a double name, Market Garden. Market was the airborne part. 3 Allied airborne divisions, dropped in broad daylight, would seize a chain of bridges over canals and rivers in the Netherlands, near Eindhoven, Grave, Nijmegen, and finally at Arnhem, where the furthest and most vital bridge spanned the lower Rhine. Garden was the ground thrust. British XXX Corps, built around powerful armored units, would smash through German lines at the Belgian-Dutch border and race up a single main road, using those captured bridges to cross one water obstacle after another. On the maps spread out in Allied headquarters, a thin blue line marked the planned route of XXX Corps, a narrow corridor cutting deep through enemy territory. Dotted along it were the airborne drop zones and the critical bridges. At the far end of the line stood Arnhem. There, the British 1st Airborne Division, reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, was expected to land, fight its way into the town, and seize the Rhine bridge. Their orders were to hold that bridge for just a few days until the tanks arrived. In theory, it was a simple relay race. The paratroopers would grab the crossings, and the armor would link them all together in one unstoppable advance. Yet the elegance of the plan concealed serious dangers. The entire ground offensive would depend on a single elevated road running through flat, waterlogged country. If that road was blocked by wrecked vehicles, craters, or German counterattacks, the armored column would be forced to halt in a long, exposed traffic jam. The airborne forces faced their own risks, landing far ahead of friendly lines with light weapons and limited transport. They would live or die by their ability to hold out until relief arrived. If the timetable slipped, those men would be stranded in hostile territory with dwindling ammunition and no easy way out. Despite these obvious vulnerabilities, optimism carried the day. Recent victories fostered a belief that German forces in the Netherlands were disorganized, exhausted, and incapable of mounting a serious defense. Intelligence reports that pointed to the presence of armored units near Arnhem were downplayed or explained away. Concerned voices warned about the narrowness of the advance and the dependence on perfect timing. But the hunger for a decisive blow, and for the prestige that would come with it, outweighed caution. Many Allied leaders wanted to believe that one last daring operation could shorten the war dramatically. The result was a plan that balanced on a knife edge. If everything went right, Market Garden could leap over Germany's main defensive line in the west and change the course of the campaign. If anything went badly wrong, lightly armed airborne troops would find themselves isolated against stronger forces than expected, while the relief column crept forward under fire along a single exposed road. As the gliders were prepared and the paratroopers checked their equipment, the men at the sharp end had little say in the debate. They were told that they would be making history, and they were, but the history of Market Garden would not be the swift triumph many of them had been promised. Chapter 2. Red Berets in Hell, the Battle for Arnhem. At the sharp end of Montgomery's grand design stood the men of the British 1st Airborne Division and the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade. They were experienced, highly trained troops, proud of their elite status and their distinctive red berets. Many of them had waited years for a major combat jump in Western Europe. When they learned that they would be dropping near a Dutch town called Arnhem to seize the last and most important bridge over the Rhine, there was excitement rather than fear. They were told that the operation could help end the war. Few imagined how alone they would soon be. From the beginning, their part of the plan was compromised by practical constraints. The drop zones and landing zones for the paratroopers and gliders were placed several kilometers away from the Arnhem Bridge, in open areas judged safe for landing. That meant the men would have to march towards their objective instead of falling directly onto it. Worse still, there were not enough transport aircraft to deliver the entire division in a single wave. The 1st Airborne Division would come down in several lifts spread over successive days, leaving the first units on the ground without their full strength, heavy weapons, or all their commanders. A mission that required speed and concentration of force began with delay and fragmentation. Even so, the first day brought some success. Elements of the division pushed rapidly into Arnhem, moving through streets lined with Dutch civilians who risked punishment by cheering and offering water and flowers. One group, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to reach the northern end of the bridge itself. They dug in around the approaches, occupying nearby buildings and turning them into strongpoints. For a brief moment, the core promise of the operation seemed within reach. British airborne troops were holding the very bridge that XXX Corps was supposed to cross on its way into Germany. But the reality around Arnhem was far more dangerous than many in Allied headquarters had allowed themselves to believe. German forces in the area were not simply scattered remnants. Elements of 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting nearby, battered from earlier fighting, but still equipped with tanks, armored vehicles, and experienced infantry. As the airborne troops fought to consolidate their positions, German units reacted quickly, probing the British perimeter, cutting roads, and seizing key junctions. Communications began to fail, with radios proving unreliable in the built-up terrain, and some units became isolated almost from the start. For the men around the bridge, the battle soon turned into a brutal urban siege. They were lightly armed and short on anti-tank weapons, facing German armor and artillery at close quarters. Tanks fired into houses at point-blank range, collapsing walls and setting buildings on fire. Snipers hunted any movement in the rubble. Casualties mounted, and ammunition stocks ran dangerously low. Still, the small British force clung to its positions, fighting from room to room and staircase to staircase. Their task was simple and terrible. Hold on for as long as possible and trust that the sound of British tank engines would eventually rise above the noise of battle. Elsewhere around Arnhem, the situation was equally desperate, but for different reasons. Units that had landed further from the town struggled to fight their way through a rapidly tightening German ring. Roadblocks, ambushes, and counterattacks slowed or halted their advance. Some glider loads had been scattered or destroyed, depriving them of vital equipment, including additional anti-tank guns and vehicles. The clear, optimistic timetable drawn on planning maps dissolved into confusion on the ground. Hours slipped by, then days, and still there was no sign of the promised link-up with XXX Corps. As the pressure increased, the contrast between the original vision of Market Garden and the reality at Arnhem grew painfully clear. The airborne troops had done what was asked of them. They had dropped behind enemy lines, seized key ground, and fought with determination to hold it. But they were paying the price for a plan that left them too far from friendly lines, with too little support, facing stronger opposition than expected. In street after street, the red berets were no longer the spearhead of a triumphant advance. They were surrounded men, fighting not to win the war by Christmas, but simply to survive from one hour to the next. Chapter 3. The Germans were waiting. Fatal intelligence failures. One of the most enduring controversies of Market Garden is whether it had to fail. Could better intelligence and more careful planning have prevented the disaster at Arnhem? Or were there clear warnings that were simply ignored in the rush to launch what seemed like a war-winning strike? The answer lies in a chain of mistakes, missed signals, and fatal overconfidence that left British paratroopers dropping into a trap that, with hindsight, should have been foreseen. In the weeks before the operation, Allied intelligence officers received troubling information. Reconnaissance photographs taken by low-flying aircraft showed tanks and armored vehicles in wooded areas near Arnhem. These were not the remnants of broken units retreating in disorder. They were elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, and the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, battle-hardened formations that had been pulled back from the front to rest and refit. Though they were under strength, and short of fuel, they still represented a serious threat to lightly armed airborne troops. The presence of these units should have raised immediate alarm. Yet when these reports reached higher command levels, they were downplayed or dismissed. Some officers argued that the German armor was too weak to pose a real danger, that the units were in the process of withdrawing, or that they would not be able to react quickly enough to disrupt the airborne landing. There was also a powerful institutional reluctance to call off an operation that had already been planned in detail and approved at the highest levels. Montgomery and his staff had invested enormous effort and prestige in Market Garden, and there was strong pressure to proceed. Doubts were swept aside by the momentum of optimism and the desire for a decisive victory. Contributing to this dangerous underestimation was a broader failure to understand the enemy's situation accurately. Allied commanders had grown accustomed to German defeats in France and Belgium, and many assumed that the Wehrmacht was on the verge of collapse. Intelligence assessments reflected this bias, filtering reports through the lens of what planners wanted to believe, rather than what the evidence actually showed. The idea that German forces might still be capable of organizing a rapid and effective response seemed inconsistent with the narrative of imminent victory that had taken hold in Allied headquarters. There were also warnings from the Dutch resistance, members of the underground who risked their lives gathering information, reported the presence of German armor and reinforcements around Arnhem. Some of these reports reached British intelligence officers attached to the airborne forces. At least one officer, Major Brian Urquhart, raised urgent concerns about the threat and even arranged for additional reconnaissance flights to confirm the presence of tanks. He argued forcefully that the plan should be reconsidered or that the drop zones should be moved. His warnings were ignored, and he was reportedly sent on leave to recover from what was described as stress or exhaustion. The concerns of a field intelligence officer were no match for the determination of senior commanders to proceed. The decision to stick with distant drop zones compounded the problem. The choice to land several kilometers from the Arnhem Bridge was justified on the grounds that closer areas were unsuitable for gliders and would expose aircraft to heavy anti-aircraft fire. But this decision guaranteed that the airborne troops would lose the element of surprise and would have to fight their way into the town, giving German defenders precious time to organize. When those defenders turned out to include SS Panzer units with tanks and experienced infantry, the result was predictable. Perhaps the most painful irony is that German commanders were themselves surprised by the location and scale of the Allied airborne assault. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces in the area, was at his headquarters near Arnhem when the first paratroops and gliders began landing. He initially assumed it was a raid to capture him personally and hurriedly evacuated, but once the shock passed, German officers reacted with speed and professionalism, deploying the forces they had on hand and calling for reinforcements. The very units that Allied intelligence had dismissed as ineffective became the hammer that crushed the British 1st Airborne Division. Market Garden was launched with flawed intelligence, shaped by wishful thinking, institutional momentum, and a refusal to listen to inconvenient warnings. The men who jumped from aircraft over Arnhem paid the price for decisions made far from the battlefield. They were not defeated by an unbeatable enemy. They were defeated by a combination of German competence and Allied miscalculation, a failure that turned a daring plan into a deadly miscalculation and left the Red Berets fighting not for victory, but simply for survival against an enemy that should never have been there. Chapter 4. The Price of Failure. Consequences and Legacy. By the fourth day of Market Garden, the dream of a swift breakthrough into Germany had turned into a nightmare. At the Arnhem Bridge, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's men were still clinging to their positions, but their situation had become hopeless. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The wounded were crowding into cellars with no morphine or medical supplies, and German tanks were systematically demolishing the buildings they occupied. Around them, the town burned. On the morning of September 21st, after holding out for far longer than anyone had thought possible, the last defenders were finally overwhelmed. Frost himself, wounded and barely conscious, was taken prisoner along with the survivors of his battalion. Elsewhere in the Arnhem pocket, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were pressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. XXX Corps had finally reached Nijmegen and captured the bridge there after a desperate river crossing by American paratroopers. But the final push to Arnhem stalled in the face of German resistance and the sheer difficulty of advancing along a single narrow road under constant fire. The relief that the airborne troops had been promised was not coming. Cut off, surrounded, and running out of everything, the British and Polish forces fought on with stubborn courage, but courage alone could not change the outcome. On the night of September 25th, 9 days after the operation began, the decision was made to evacuate what was left of the division. Under cover of darkness and rain, the survivors were pulled back across the lower Rhine in small boats, leaving their dead and many of their wounded behind. Of the roughly 10,000 men from the 1st Airborne Division and Polish Brigade who had landed near Arnhem, fewer than 2,400 made it back across the river. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. The pride of British airborne forces had been shattered in a battle that should never have been fought on those terms. The human cost of Market Garden extended beyond the paratroopers. Thousands of American airborne troops were killed or wounded, fighting to hold the other bridges along the corridor. Dutch civilians in Arnhem and the surrounding towns paid a terrible price as well. Many were killed in the crossfire or by German shelling and air attacks. After the battle, in retaliation for Dutch assistance to the Allies, the German occupiers expelled the entire population of Arnhem and looted the city. Thousands faced starvation during the brutal winter that followed, a period the Dutch remember as the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter, the operation that was meant to liberate them, brought devastation instead. Strategically, the failure of Market Garden had significant consequences. The Allies did not reach the Rhine in 1944, and the war in Europe would continue for another 8 months. The German army, though battered, was given time to regroup and reinforce its defenses along the Western Front. In December, German forces would launch a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, which inflicted heavy Allied casualties and delayed the final advance into Germany. The confidence that the war could be won by Christmas evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a long, hard slog through fortified positions and winter weather. The operation also exposed deep flaws in Allied planning and inter-service cooperation. The airborne forces and the ground commanders had operated with different assumptions and inadequate communication. Intelligence failures, over-optimism, and a reluctance to challenge senior officers had all contributed to the disaster. In the aftermath, recriminations and debates began. Montgomery defended the operation, arguing that it had been 90% successful and that only bad luck at Arnhem had prevented complete victory. Others, including many who had fought on the ground, saw it differently. Market Garden had been a gamble based on faulty intelligence and wishful thinking, and the men at Arnhem had paid the price for decisions made by commanders who were too distant from the reality of the battlefield. Yet amid the failure, there were also stories of extraordinary heroism and sacrifice. The men who held the bridge at Arnhem, the American paratroopers who stormed across the Wall River at Nijmegen under fire, the Polish troops who tried desperately to reinforce their British comrades, and the Dutch civilians who risked their lives to help Allied soldiers. All of them showed courage that deserves to be remembered. The battle became a symbol of determination in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to what soldiers can endure even when the plans that sent them into danger prove to be fatally flawed. The legacy of Market Garden is complex. It stands as a warning about the dangers of overconfidence, the importance of listening to intelligence warnings, and the cost of operational plans that depend on everything going perfectly. But it is also a story about human resilience, about men who fought with everything they had, even when victory was no longer possible. The phrase, "a bridge too far," entered the language as shorthand for ambition that outstrips reality. For the survivors and the families of those who did not return, Arnhem was not just a military failure. It was a place where hope, courage, and lives were spent in a battle that, with better judgment, might never have needed to be fought at all. Market Garden was meant to be the operation that ended the war in the West. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and the cost of ignoring warnings that contradict what commanders want to believe. The men who fought at Arnhem, Nijmegen, and along the narrow corridor through the Netherlands showed extraordinary bravery. But bravery alone could not overcome flawed intelligence, poor planning, and an enemy that proved far stronger than expected. The failure left scars that lasted long after the last shots were fired. For the soldiers who survived, Arnhem was a wound that never fully healed. For the Dutch civilians caught in the battle and the reprisals that followed, it meant months of suffering through one of the harshest winters of the war. And for the Allied High Command, it was a harsh reminder that wars are not won by daring gestures alone, but by careful preparation, accurate intelligence, and realistic assessment of what is possible. Yet even in failure, there is something worth remembering. The red-berets who held the bridge, the American paratroopers who crossed the wall under fire, the Polish soldiers who tried to break through to their surrounded comrades. These men fought not because they believed victory was certain, but because they had been given a mission, and they would see it through to the end. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored, even as we recognize that the operation that sent them into battle was deeply flawed. Market Garden remains a bridge too far, a bold plan that reached beyond what was achievable and fell short at the cost of thousands of lives. It stands as a reminder that in war, as in all things, ambition must be tempered by realism, and that the consequences of failure are measured not in lost prestige, but in the lives of those who pay the price for decisions made far from the battlefield.